The temp badge clipped deliberately low on Rachel Torres's scrubs caught the fluorescent light for exactly half a second before she angled her body to shadow it. Mercy General in San Diego didn't ask too many questions about contract nurses. They needed bodies in beds, and her credentials were flawless. Clean. Invisible. Exactly what she needed. She moved through the third-floor corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to take up less space than air. Her steady hands drew blood without tremor, her voice pitched soft enough to calm panic without drawing attention. 2 years of civilian nursing under her maiden name. 2 years of fluorescent-lit rooms instead of sandstorms. 2 years of trying to disappear into the kind of anonymity that didn't exist in the Navy anymore. The photo was in her locker, tucked behind the extra scrubs and the dying succulent she'd forgotten to water since Tuesday. 8 people in desert fatigues taken outside a field hospital 20 kilometers north of Baghdad. 4 faces circled in permanent marker. 2 of them had names she couldn't say out loud anymore, not even in her apartment at 3 in the morning. Rachel clipped a patient's fur line into the port with the precision of someone who'd done it in sandstorms while mortar rounds walked up the street outside the medical tent. 18-gauge angiocath needle. Perfect angle. The vein accepted it without collapse. She didn't feel the satisfaction anymore, just the muscle memory of competence, reliable as gravity. That was when Dr. Marcus Sterling arrived on shift. His white coat was crisp. His jawline could cut glass, the kind that opened doors and closed investigative files before they got uncomfortable. The hospital board had buried his last malpractice settlement so deep that only 3 people knew it existed. His brother-in-law was the hospital board chairman. The nurse director had been sleeping with him for 2 years. Everyone at Mercy General knew the real hierarchy, and it had nothing to do with the organizational chart posted in the break room. Rachel was prepping the medication cart on 4 South when Sterling approached the nursing station with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras. The cardiac patient in 4412 had been admitted 4 hours prior, sepsis complications, ejection fraction declining. Sterling was already reviewing the orders, already moving, already the center of gravity that pulled everyone else into his orbit. The attending ordered digoxin. 2.5 micrograms per kilogram for a 94-kilogram female with reduced renal clearance. Rachel's eyes caught the calculation on the chart. She read the numbers again. Then again. Wrong. The dose would push the patient into toxicity with a creatinine clearance of 28. The attending had ignored the lab values completely. Rachel had seen this before, in training, in textbooks, twice in actual practice. The 3rd time she'd said something, the patient survived. The 2 times she hadn't, they coded within 8 hours. She set down the medication cart. Dr. Sterling. Her voice came out steady. Deferential. The voice she'd been practicing for 2 years. The digoxin calculation for 4412. He turned. So did the residents. The dose accounts for renal clearance. Rachel kept her hands visible, open, non-threatening. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had given orders to Marines and Navy SEALs in combat zones. Civilian Rachel Torres asked permission to ask questions. The patient's creatinine is 2.1. That changes the clearance significantly. The silence was the kind that happens when someone has just made a mistake in front of witnesses and is deciding how to respond. Sterling's jaw tightened. One of the residents, a young man with anxiety creases around his eyes, looked at the chart. His face went pale. "I'll recalculate," Sterling said. His voice had dropped an octave. "Dangerous. You can return to your tasks, nurse." Rachel turned back to the medication cart. The hospital computer system pinged 15 seconds later. The dose had been revised. The residents would never forget that correction, though they'd learned to hide it because that was how hierarchy worked at Mercy General. You protected power structures or you found yourself locked out. Rachel understood this in her bones. She was restocking the crash cart on for North when orderly Marcus Chen backed through the supply room door carrying a stack of fur stands, and the edge of his hand caught the broken glass someone had left in the sharps bin. Blood. Lots of it. flowing fast. The artery was nicked but not severed. He had maybe 90 seconds before panic set in and he started moving it in ways that would make it worse. Rachel was there before she registered moving. Her hands worked on their own. Muscle memory didn't require permission. Her left hand applied direct pressure while her right formed a three-fingered clamp around the radial artery using the same technique she'd learned in a classified field hospital outside Baghdad where the instructors were Delta Force medics and the patients were Marines coming in with limbs hanging by connective tissue. The technique wasn't taught in American civilian nursing schools. It required pressure applied at exactly 3 points simultaneously to occlude the artery completely while maintaining distal circulation. Marcus's panic subsided. His breathing slowed. The bleeding stopped becoming a crisis and became data. "You're okay," Rachel said. Her voice had shifted down into something that sounded like authority. "Don't move your hand. Just breathe." She called for a nurse to fetch the trauma kit. Applied a proper pressure dressing. Got the bleeding stopped in 4 minutes flat. Marcus would be fine. The artery would heal. He'd remember that the temp nurse had reacted like she'd done field trauma 1,000 times, and then he'd decide it was just training, just experience, nothing unusual. People saw what they expected to see. A temp nurse who knew how to manage an arterial wound was just well-trained. Not remarkable. Invisible. That was the entire point. Marcus left. Rachel sanitized her hands and returned to the crash cart. The Combat Support Hospital rotation brought in a medic named Holloway who'd spent 5 years with the Army's 160th SAW Night Stalkers doing medical support for special operations. He was rotating through Mercy General's trauma rotation for continuing education. He was 42, weathered, with eyes that had seen things that didn't have names in polite conversation. He was also very, very observant. Rachel was prepping an 4-line for a trauma patient, 14-gauge, trauma protocol, steady hands, when Holloway walked into the treatment area and went completely still. She felt his attention the way you feel a laser sight on your back. She didn't look up. She finished the 4-line. Secured the dressing. Checked the flow rate. All textbook smooth. When she finally turned, Holloway was watching her with the careful stillness of a predator that had just identified another apex predator in its territory. His eyes tracked the way her hands moved. The efficiency. The lack of hesitation. The 3-finger tension technique she'd used to apply pressure without blocking distal circulation when she'd assisted on a critical bleed 6 months ago, a technique that only came from one training pipeline, one specific field hospital, one war zone where they taught you to work under fire. Rachel met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. She gave him the slightest shake of her head. "Don't." Holloway's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, recognition settling into place like a safe closing. He nodded once. Just barely. Then he turned and walked back out of the treatment area, and neither of them said another word about it. This was what happened when you'd trained with the best and survived in places where survival required more than just skill. You recognized your own kind, and you knew that some people had good reasons for wanting to be invisible. Rachel clipped her badge low and moved through the corridors of Mercy General like she'd been designed to take up less space than air, steady hands drawing blood, voice soft enough to calm panic without drawing attention. The fluorescent lights hummed above antiseptic-scented hallways where a temp nurse worked another contract at another hospital where no one asked questions. No one asked about the faded unit patch sewn carefully into the jacket lining in her locker, visible only when the fabric folded just right. No one asked about the photo of 8 people in desert fatigues, for faces circled in permanent marker. But Dr. Marcus Sterling had noticed something. He'd noticed that a temp nurse, a nobody with a low-clip badge, had been smart enough to catch his medication calculation. He'd noticed that she'd handled an arterial wound with field medicine precision. He'd noticed that a combat medic had looked at her like he'd just recognized a threat. And more than anything else, Dr. Sterling had noticed that she wasn't afraid of him. That was going to be a problem. The fluorescent lights above the nurse's station cast everything in institutional white as Dr. Sterling arrived with his entourage of residents trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark. Rachel was restocking medication cards when she heard his voice, not raised, which made it worse. Calculated. He leaned against the counter, fingers drumming against the polished surface with the rhythm of someone who owned the air he breathed. "I'm making a wager," he announced, loud enough for the entire station to hear. "Our temp badge here," he gestured vaguely in Rachel's direction without looking at her, "won't last a week. Anyone want to take that bet? I'm thinking 500 says she quits by Friday." Laughter scattered through the nurse's station like coins dropped on tile. One of the residents, a nervous kid who looked barely old enough to shave, nervously joined in. Rachel didn't look up from the medication cards. Her hands continued their methodical work, each card placed with precision. The silence she maintained was its own kind of answer, but it wasn't the one Sterling wanted. He wanted her flustered. He wanted her to defend herself. He wanted, more than anything, to see her crack. She didn't. 3 days later, Rachel carried her lunch tray through the cafeteria with the same invisible quality she applied to everything in her life. The tray held a salad, a cup of soup, and a bottle of water. She had learned long ago to keep her meals simple, easier to clean up, harder to weaponize. She didn't see Sterling until he was already moving, his elbow jerking outward with the kind of exaggerated casualness that only looked accidental to people who weren't paying attention. Rachel was always paying attention. The tray went vertical for a suspended moment, soup describing an arc through the recycled air, salad spinning like a slow-motion grenade. The crash came hard, ceramic shattering against linoleum, the wet splatter of lunch spreading across the floor like a crime scene. Sterling's colleagues at the adjacent table erupted in laughter, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who had never had anything taken from them without warning. "Clumsy," Sterling said, watching her crouch to gather the debris. "Maybe nursing isn't your calling, sweetheart." Rachel picked up the pieces one by one. A chunk of bowl. A soaked napkin. A spoon. Her movements were methodical, unhurried, the practiced efficiency of someone who had cleaned far worse things in far worse places. The sound of her breathing was steady. The sound of her collecting the scattered meal was the only noise in a suddenly watchful cafeteria. She felt the attention like weight, like pressure, like the particular attention that comes right before something breaks. One tear escaped her left eye. She let it fall. Didn't wipe it immediately. Just continued picking up the soup-soaked lettuce with her bare hand, deliberate and slow. When she finally stood, the tear had traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her gaze never leaving Sterling's face. The eye contact was a weapon. The composure was a weapon. Even the tear was a weapon, not a sign of weakness but a display of control so absolute that she could afford to show one and have it mean nothing. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than this, doctor," she said softly. Her voice carried no anger, no defensiveness, no desperation, which made it far more devastating than if she'd screamed. She walked to the trash bin and disposed of the remains of her lunch, then continued to her break, leaving Sterling standing there with his hand still suspended in mid-laugh. The following Tuesday, during morning rounds, Sterling threw a patient chart at her feet. The pages scattered like autumn leaves, spreading across the polished floor in a violent display of disorganization. Medical records, vital signs, treatment notes, all of it scattered, requiring collection, requiring kneeling, requiring the profound humiliation of gathering your own scattered professional identity in front of an audience. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of dehumanization. The chief of surgery stood 3 feet away, observing. 2 residents watched. A nursing intern froze mid-stride. Rachel took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in military training, the kind that centered the nervous system and quieted the chemical cascade of a threat response. She crouched. The sound of her knees bending was the only acknowledgement she gave that the request had even registered. She picked up each page with deliberate care, stacking them in proper order, not haphazardly, but with the precision of someone trained to organize chaos under pressure. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't shake when she finally stood and held out the reassembled chart. "I've picked up heavier things than your insecurity, doctor," she said quietly. The words landed like a surgical strike. Clean. Precise. Lethal in their simplicity. A resident coughed, actually coughed, to hide a laugh. The chief of surgery's eyebrows rose fractionally. Sterling's face went crimson, the color of sunburn, of embarrassment, of rage carefully controlled because the wrong audience was watching. He smiled instead. It was the smile of a predator recalculating. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Your attention to detail is noted." The message was clear. This wasn't over. This was just escalating. That afternoon, Sterling sat in his office with the door closed. The Venetian blinds cut the afternoon sunlight into prison bar shadows across his mahogany desk. He pulled out his phone and dialed his brother-in-law, who sat on the hospital board. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. "I need documentation on a staff member," Sterling said without preamble. "Gross negligence. Unsafe practice. I'm going to need someone in administration watching her like a hawk. Everything she does, every procedure she touches, I want it documented and flagged. Can you make that happen?" His brother-in-law was a lawyer. He understood implications and liability and the particular vulnerability of temp staff. "I'll make a call to HR," he said. Sterling hung up and immediately dialed again. The nursing director answered on the second ring. This woman, Patricia something, though Sterling had never bothered to learn her last name, had been sleeping with him for 2 years. She had made herself useful by ignoring his affairs, his drinking, his periodic rages. She had made herself complicit, which was almost the same as making herself loyal. "Patricia, I need a favor," he said, and listened to her instant agreement before he'd even explained what he needed. This was the architecture of institutional corruption, one compromise at a time, one small favor building on another until entire systems bent to the will of men like Sterling. "I need you to monitor one of the nurses. Rachel Torres. The temp. Document any mistakes, any protocol violations, anything that looks remotely suspicious. I'm concerned about patient safety." The lie came so easily that it barely registered as a lie anymore. By evening, something shifted at Mercy General, nothing visible, nothing obvious, but a certain kind of attention had turned toward Rachel Torres. The kind that came with clipboards and increased scrutiny. The kind that meant every action was being recorded, every movement catalogued, every decision questioned. Rachel didn't know it yet. She was in her small apartment in a neighborhood where nobody knew her name, sitting on a bed that sagged slightly on the left side, staring at a photograph printed on cheap glossy paper. The photo showed 9 people in desert camouflage, standing in front of a field hospital tent outside Baghdad, 2008. Rachel stood fourth from the left, her face younger but her eyes already carrying the particular weight that came from having held dying people in her hands. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, the nameplate would have read if anyone had bothered to preserve the formality. 4 of the 9 people in that photograph weren't alive anymore. She opened the small bottle of anxiety medication prescribed by a VA therapist who'd asked too many careful questions about nightmares and hypervigilance. Her hands trembled, actually trembled, as she swallowed the pill with tap water from a glass that had never been properly clean. The trembling wasn't fear of what was coming. It was the particular exhaustion of maintaining a composure that deep, that absolute, that required the constant suppression of every instinct that screamed at her to respond. She had survived 18 years in the military. She had survived Baghdad. She had survived the nights when the sounds came back and the smell of diesel fuel and blood became so real she had to turn on every light in her apartment to convince herself she was home. She was not going to be destroyed by Dr. Sterling and his petty institutional tyranny. But the machinery was already in motion. The calls were already made. The documentation was already starting. And in the morning, when a Delta Force colonel would arrive by helicopter with shrapnel complications and catastrophic bleeding, when Rachel would move into the operating room with hands that remembered exactly how to save lives in ways that Sterling's textbook training never could have prepared him for, that was when everything would accelerate. That was when the real nightmare would begin. The Black Hawk descended through the San Diego fog like a mechanical predator, its rotors shaking the entire hospital roof as orderlies scattered and the ER trauma alert screamed through every overhead speaker. Code Black. Incoming. Delta Force Colonel, IED shrapnel, 3-vehicle convoy ambush outside of Fallujah, Anbar Province, blood loss estimated at 40% of circulating volume. The bird touched down and Rachel was already moving, her scrub still damp from the orderly she'd stabilized in Bay 2, her hands already reaching for the trauma gown before anyone shouted her name. The medic team unloaded the stretcher with the choreography of men who had done this in actual sandstorms. Colonel Marcus Halloway, 5th Battalion Operational Commander, unconscious, pressure bandages soaked through, his left leg a geometrical wrongness of angles and exposed bone. Rachel was third into the operating room behind Dr. Sterling and the attending anesthesiologist, gloved and gowned and moving with the kind of invisible efficiency that made the scrub nurse assume she'd worked 100 trauma cases when the truth was she'd worked 1,000, and most of them in places where the dust never settled and the helicopters never stopped coming. The surgical field opened, massive lacerations across his abdomen, the peritoneal cavity exposed like a butcher's window, shrapnel fragments glinting like dark teeth. Dr. Sterling barked orders with the tone of a man used to having rooms bend around his voice, and Rachel anticipated every instrument before he named it, moving with her hands held at the precise angle she'd learned in a combat surgical hospital where seconds were blood loss and minutes were organs, where the margin between saved and lost was the width of a needle. The attending gasped. The scrub nurse exchanged a glance with Rachel. That was not the behavior of a temporary contract nurse. That was muscle memory. That was someone who had held bleeding soldiers while counting down a clock that only existed in her head. 2 hours, 17 minutes. That was how long it took to close the colonel's abdomen, to pack the lacerations, to stabilize the shattered left femur with an external fixator that would buy time for vascular surgery tomorrow. Dr. Sterling stepped back, stripped his gloves, made a small satisfied sound that meant he was already thinking about the next case, about his dinner reservation, about how he would work this into conversation at the board dinner next week. Rachel was the last to step away from the surgical bed, her eyes tracking the monitors one final time, blood pressure 118/72, heart rate 84, O2 sat 97% on supplemental oxygen. Stable. The colonel's color was better. They had bought him life. She was finishing her notes at the nurse's station on the 4th floor when the first alarm screamed. The monitors erupted like a nest of birds startled, a chorus of high-pitched electronic panic that turned heads across the ICU. Bed 447. The colonel. Rachel's pen was still in her hand when she moved, not running, never running in a hospital, it scared people, but moving with the velocity of someone who had already understood the problem before she reached the room. The attending on night shift was there, a good doctor named Reeves, but his hands were shaking and his face had gone the particular color of a man watching something slip through his fingers. The colonel's blood pressure had collapsed. 71/39 and dropping. Heart rate 147. The monitors showed sinus tachycardia with electrical alternans, a pattern that meant his heart was drowning in its own fluid, pressure building in the pericardial sac around the organ like a noose tightening. Cardiac tamponade. Rachel could see it in the way Reeves's breathing had become shallow, in the way his eyes flicked between the monitor and the patient and then toward the phone to call cardiothoracic surgery, surgery that was 40 minutes away, 40 minutes that the colonel did not have. The pressure around his heart was crushing the ventricles, strangling the organ's ability to fill, and every second that passed was another milliliter of blood pooling in the space where there was no room. Call cardiothoracic, Reeves said, his voice already making peace with the outcome. Call them now. And get the crash cart. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, responding to the overhead code alert like a shark sensing blood in water, and the first thing out of his mouth was wrong. Prepare for emergency thoracotomy. We're going to do open cardiac massage. Rachel moved before her brain had finished processing the decision. She grabbed the ultrasound machine from the corner of the room, a portable sonocyte no larger than a loaf of bread, the same device she had used to assess fluid accumulation in the abdomens of wounded Marines in a makeshift clinic outside Tikrit. The gel was still on the wand from the last case. She placed it on the colonel's chest in the parasternal long-axis view, and the ultrasound image bloomed on the screen like a terrible flower. The pericardial sac distended and black with fluid, the right atrium nearly collapsed from the external pressure, the heart struggling against the weight of its own spilled blood. "Stop," Rachel said. Not a question. Not a request. The word landed in the room like a command, and something in the tone of it made both Reeves and Sterling pause. "Pericardiocentesis. Now." Dr. Sterling's face flushed. "You are not authorized to." Rachel was already opening the pericardiocentesis tray, her hands moving through the sequence like a prayer: the needle, the 18-gauge catheter, the syringe, the ultrasound guide. She had done this before. She had done this in a field hospital where the roof shook from the impact of incoming mortars and the sterile field was a folding table and the only light was a surefire flashlight clamped between the shoulder and chin of the medic across from her. She had done this while calling in coordinates to a Black Hawk gunship and watching a 19-year-old lance corporal trying not to scream. "You do not have the authority to perform this procedure without physician oversight," Sterling said, his voice hardening into the tone of a man sensing his control slipping. "Dr. Reeves, remove her from the room." But Reeves was watching the ultrasound screen. Reeves could see what Rachel had seen. Reeves knew that the window was closing. Rachel prepped the entry site, 5th intercostal space, parasternal, the location where the needle would slide between the ribs and enter the pericardial sac at the precise angle that meant safety. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone for whom this was not new, for whom the human body was a map she had already memorized in the worst possible classroom. The needle advanced, guided by the ultrasound image, and she felt the subtle resistance change as it breached the pericardium, that small tactile confirmation that meant she was in the right place. She aspirated slowly. The syringe filled with dark red blood, 40 milliliters, then 50, then 60. The fluid drained from the sac like releasing air from a tourniquet, and on the ultrasound screen the heart expanded, the right atrium filling again, the chambers no longer crushed. The monitors steadied. The blood pressure climbed, 79/44, then 84/48, then 91/52. The heart rate dropped from 147 to 118. The electrical alternan smoothed into a clean sinus rhythm. The alarms stopped their screaming. The room held its breath. The colonel's pressure continued climbing, 98/58, 102/61, then 108/65. Stable. The color began to return to his face. The right atrium on the ultrasound screen was chambers full and pink again, the heart no longer drowning. Rachel withdrew the needle and secured the catheter with a single strip of tape, movements made in silence, made in the kind of quiet that came after the storm had passed. She did not look at Dr. Sterling. She did not look at Dr. Reeves. She simply finished the procedure with the precision of someone finishing a ritual, someone for whom the completion mattered more than anything that happened around it. "Secure that catheter," she said quietly, to no one in particular, to the room itself. "Maintain sinus rhythm monitoring. Notify cardiothoracic that the patient is stable for transfer to the cath lab." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, watching her, his eyes the color of something angry and calculating, his hands clenched at his sides. She could feel the moment something shifted in him, the moment his brain stopped processing what he had just witnessed and started instead processing how to make it stop mattering. The moment he decided. He walked out of the room without speaking. Rachel waited 7 minutes before removing her gloves. She waited until the monitors had stabilized completely, until Dr. Reeves had confirmed the catheter placement with a chest X-ray, until the cardiothoracic team had been contacted and was en route. She waited until there was nothing left to do but wait. Then she stripped the gloves and walked to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror without recognition, the way a soldier might look at a uniform they had worn in a different life. In the hallway, Dr. Sterling was making phone calls. The first call went to his brother-in-law on the hospital board. "We have a dangerous situation developing with credentialing. An unauthorized procedure. Scope of practice violation. We need to act tonight." The second call went to the nursing director. The one who visited his apartment on Tuesday afternoons. The one whose career he controlled by simple proximity and implication. I need Rachel Torres terminated. First thing tomorrow morning. Dangerous unsupervised procedures. You handle the paperwork, I'll provide documentation. The third call went to the state licensing investigator who had received 7 referrals from Dr. Sterling over the past 2 years, referrals that had led to 2 suspensions and 1 permanent license revocation. I have evidence of a nurse performing advanced procedures without authorization. I'll be sending images and documentation within the hour. He was still talking when Rachel walked past him in the hallway, her badge already pulled from around her neck, already knowing what would happen in the morning, already understanding that some hospitals protect their sharks and feed their inconvenient tigers to the wolves. The phone call started at 11:06 p.m. Dr. Sterling sat in his apartment with a glass of scotch that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent, his brother-in-law's voice on speaker, the brother-in-law who controlled 3 hospital board seats through his medical device company contracts. Unsupervised surgical procedure, Sterling was saying, voice smooth as oil. She performed needle pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. A Navy corpsman might have been trained for combat situations, but this is a hospital. We have protocols. He didn't mention that the colonel would have been dead in 4 minutes without that exact procedure. The brother-in-law laughed, a sound like a predator settling in for the kill. Send me documentation. I'll handle the board meeting. The second call went to Janet Reeves, the nursing director, who answered her phone in the dark because she always did when Sterling called, her voice wrapped in that particular softness reserved for men with power. Sterling was businesslike this time, almost clinical. I need you to file a formal complaint. Scope of practice violation. She circumvented medical authority during an active emergency. Janet would do it. She'd been doing exactly what Sterling wanted for 2 years, ever since he'd first pressed her against the staff bathroom door and made her understand that her career depended on his goodwill. The third call was to Marcus Webb, a state licensing investigator Sterling had been feeding cases to for 18 months, always the right cases, always the ones that went Sterling's way. I have a nurse, Sterling said, who performed an invasive surgical procedure on a patient without proper authorization. I have witnesses. I have documentation. Webb's voice came back tired but interested. Send it over. By midnight, the machinery was in motion. Rachel didn't know any of this. She was standing in the break room eating a granola bar she'd packed 3 days ago, staring at nothing, replaying the moment when the colonel's blood pressure had climbed off the floor, 80/50, then 85, then 92/02, saturation rising from 71 to 88 to stable at 96, the hiss of air escaping the pericardium like a small animal finally released from a trap. The attending surgeon had watched her the entire time, his face the color of old concrete, his hands completely useless. She'd saved a man's life in front of witnesses, and it was going to destroy her. The termination notice came at 7:15 a.m., delivered by security and Janet Reeves in a small office off the main hallway. They didn't offer her coffee. The director slid a single-page letter across a particle board desk that hadn't seen polish in a decade. Rachel read it once, then again. Gross violation of scope of practice protocols. Performing invasive procedures without physician authorization or oversight. Effective immediately. The words sat in front of her like artifacts from someone else's life. The colonel would have died, Rachel said. Her voice was completely steady. This was the voice she used when her squad was pinned down and there was still a job to do. His pericardium was filling with blood. I identified the tamponade on ultrasound and performed needle decompression. If I had waited, we understand your intentions, Janet said, and Rachel heard the lie in every syllable. Janet knew exactly what had happened. She'd read the same chart. She'd seen the order written in Sterling's handwriting at 2:15 a.m., do not allow Torres to approach this patient. Janet also knew that Janet would never, ever stand up to a man like Sterling. Janet was the kind of woman who'd been told her whole life that silence was loyalty. But you don't have the authority to perform surgical procedures. Dr. Sterling has filed a detailed complaint with the state board. We have no choice. The security guard, a man named Morrison who'd always said good morning to Rachel in the hallway, wouldn't meet her eyes. He was probably thinking about his pension. Everyone at Mercy General was always thinking about their pension. Rachel stood up. She didn't slam the letter down or raise her voice. She simply gathered her credentials and turned toward the door. "You'll need to clean out your locker," Janet said. "By 8 a.m. The locker was in the basement, near the old morgue, down a hallway where nobody went unless they had to. Rachel's hands were steady as she turned the combination lock. 3 years of night shifts and 14-hour trauma shifts, of mentoring residents who'd forgotten more about anatomy than they'd ever actually learn, of correcting other people's mistakes and accepting no recognition for it. Everything she owned came out in less than 90 seconds. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from a med student she'd trained who'd gone on to Johns Hopkins. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot shaped like a tiny cat, something she kept forgetting to water. Her jacket, with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, so small that only someone who knew what to look for would ever find it. And the photograph. A Polaroid from 2006, taken outside FOB Shank in Loga Province, her trauma team arranged in 2 rows. 12 people in the photo. 8 of them had made it home. She set everything in a cardboard box that Morrison handed her without a word, and when she turned toward the exit, Dr. Sterling was standing in the hallway 50 feet away, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. He was good at this. He was very good at this. He'd done it before. He'd been doing it his entire career, finding people who challenged him and erasing them with the machinery of institutions. Rachel didn't acknowledge him. She simply walked past as if he were furniture, as if his entire existence was beneath her notice. This was the hardest thing she'd done that morning, harder than accepting the termination, harder than watching Janet not meet her eyes. Because in her chest, where no one could see, something that had been held together by discipline and routine and the simple daily act of showing up was beginning to fracture. She made it to the side exit before the rain started. San Diego rain in October, the kind that comes hard and sudden, hammering the parking lot like something angry. Rachel stood at the bus stop 3 blocks away, the cardboard box balanced on her hip because the handles weren't worth trusting, and she was completely soaked through within 30 seconds. Her scrubs clung to her like skin. Rain ran down the back of her neck and into the collar of her jacket. She didn't move. She didn't wait under the shelter. She just stood there in the downpour with everything she owned in a box that was starting to soften at the bottom, and she thought about the person she'd been 18 years ago when she'd raised her right hand and sworn an oath that didn't have an expiration date. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. She'd chosen her maiden name for the civilian world, and she'd chosen San Diego because it was far enough from Virginia and far enough from the Naval Hospital where her last commanding officer still worked, the one who'd signed off on her separation paperwork after Baghdad had carved out pieces of her that no amount of therapy could replace. She'd chosen a temp agency and a quiet night shift because she'd wanted to disappear. She'd wanted to be nobody. She'd wanted to stop saving people because every person she saved meant a family who expected her to save the next one, meant a military structure that would call her back for one more tour, one more emergency, one more reason to pretend that the nightmares weren't getting worse. The bus came. Its doors wheezed open like a tired sigh. The driver didn't look at her. Probably thought she was homeless. Probably thought she'd just walked out of a hospital ward instead of being thrown out of one. Rachel got on. The doors closed behind her with a pneumatic hiss. Through the window, she could see Mercy General's main campus 3 blocks back, all lit up and glowing against the dark morning like it contained something pure, something worth protecting, instead of being just another institution where the Sharks always win. She didn't watch Dr. Sterling. She didn't have to. She knew exactly what he was doing right now. He was probably in his office with a cup of coffee, maybe on the phone with his brother-in-law, maybe already taking credit for the thing that had happened in the ICU. He would tell the story as though he'd been the one trying to save the colonel, as though Rachel had been the unhinged variable, the unstable element that had to be removed before she could do real damage. And he would be believed. He would be believed because he had the credential and the position and the network of men like himself, men who protected their own, men who saw people like Rachel as temporary, replaceable, useful only until they became difficult. The bus pulled away from the curb. Rachel sat in the back with a cardboard box on her lap, her fingers pressing against the photograph inside, against the faces of people she'd known and people she'd lost, and she thought about nothing at all. She'd learned that trick in Baghdad. You took the feeling, whatever it was, whatever it wanted to do to you, and you locked it in a box, and you put that box somewhere deep, and you kept walking. You kept moving. You kept your hand steady and your voice level, and you did the next thing, and then the next thing after that, until the day that something happened that reminded you that the world wasn't finished with you yet. The rain hammered the bus windows. The engine rumbled. The other passengers pretended not to notice the soaking wet woman with the falling-apart cardboard box, and Rachel Torres, who had been Reaper for 18 years, who had carried for wounded soldiers through a kill zone in Baghdad while calling in airstrikes, who had held the hand of a 19-year-old kid while his lung collapsed and she didn't have the equipment to save him, who had performed a procedure that only 300 people in the world knew how to do under pressure. Rachel Torres, who was supposed to stay hidden forever, was beginning to understand that the universe had other plans. The bus pulled away from the curb, and Rachel Torres sat in the back row with her cardboard box disintegrating at the seams, rain drumming against the window like Morse code she no longer needed to decode. She had walked away from signals and orders and the weight of command 18 years ago. Now she was walking away from everything else. The clock on the bus dashboard read 6:13 a.m. when her phone buzzed, a text from the hospital's main line, the kind of message that made her stomach drop. The Delta Force colonel had crashed. Cardiac tamponade. Dr. Sterling was shouting orders that didn't match the ultrasound readings. They needed her. They didn't know they needed her, but they did. Rachel got off at the next stop. The rain had shifted to a cold drizzle by the time she walked back through the ER doors of Mercy General, still wearing the wet scrubs from the previous shift, her badge clipped low where it always was. She didn't clock in. She didn't announce herself. The ICU corridor smelled like antiseptic and panic, that particular cocktail of human fear that moved through a hospital like a living thing. She could hear Dr. Sterling before she saw him, his voice climbing through octaves of command that had no substance behind them. Get me another unit of epinephrine. No, wait, push the dopamine. Someone call cardiothoracic. Contradictory orders firing like a man drowning, hands flailing. Rachel approached the ICU room and a security guard stepped into her path. Hospital policy. Terminated employees can't. She didn't break stride. She simply looked through him, the way a person looks through a window. The guard reached for her arm, but that was the moment the colonel's eyes opened inside the room, tracking movement. His body was seizing, tachycardic at 148, blood pressure collapsing under 70, and when he saw her silhouette in the doorway, something shifted in his consciousness. His hand lifted from the bed. His jaw worked around a single word, rasped and barely audible but unmistakable. Reaper. The security guard's grip went slack. That name hadn't been spoken aloud in civilian airspace in 18 months. Reaper. The call sign the Delta Force teams had given to the Navy combat medic who never froze, who could run into a kill zone and extract for wounded soldiers under effective fire while coordinates were still being called in overhead. The guard stepped aside. Rachel moved into the room like a person returning to a place she'd never really left. Dr. Sterling saw her and his face went through 3 different emotions in sequence, shock, rage, then something that looked almost like relief, which was worse than both. You're terminated. Security, remove her. Nobody moved. Rachel was already at the bedside, reading the monitor, reading the patient, reading the situation the way others read words on a page. The ultrasound machine on the stand was still warm. The images displayed on the screen told the story: pericardial effusion, cardiac tamponade worsening, every beat the heart was making pushing fluid deeper into the space that was supposed to contain it. 22 seconds until this man coded. Maybe 30 if she was lucky. No luck involved. Just work. She picked up the ultrasound wand. Her hands moved on their own. I need an 18-gauge needle. Now. Not a request. A command. The ICU nurse, a woman named Sarah who'd worked the line with Rachel for 6 months, snapped into motion. Yes, That landed like a bell tone in the room. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth to object and the colonel's son appeared in the doorway, a Marine captain in dress blue so sharp they looked like they could cut, and he simply said her name. Not a question. A statement. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The words came out like a door opening to a room everyone had forgotten existed. Sarah's hand went to her computer terminal. Muscle memory took over. Rachel's hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this in sandstorms with mortar rounds walking toward her position, who knew that hesitation was death. The needle entered the pericardium. The hiss of fluid escaping. Pressure releasing. The monitor responded, blood pressure climbing, heart rate stabilizing, oxygen saturation rising. Sarah was reading from her screen now, her voice shaking slightly. 18 years of active service. Combat medic designation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. 3 overseas deployments. Baghdad. Kandahar. Fallujah. The facts kept coming, each one a tile in a mosaic that nobody in this room had seen before. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part was that the next person to walk into the ICU was a Delta Force Lieutenant Colonel in full Class A uniform, moving with the kind of purposeful calm that comes from having survived things that would fracture most people. He looked at Rachel for exactly 2 seconds, recognition, respect, something that moved between them like a frequency only they could hear, and then he turned to the hospital board members who had materialized in the doorway, summoned by the gravity of what was unfolding. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres served with the United States Navy for 18 years, he said, and his voice was the kind of voice that made people stop breathing. Bronze Star. 2nd Bronze Star. Purple Heart. And the Navy Cross for carrying 4 wounded soldiers through a kill zone in Baghdad while directing helicopter extraction under sustained enemy fire. He paused between each decoration like they were chapters in a book being read aloud. The room went dead silent. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming, that particular frequency of institutional electricity that nobody usually noticed until it was the only sound left. Dr. Sterling's lawyer wasn't in the room yet, but he was going to need one. The hospital CEO stepped forward, and when she spoke her voice carried the kind of weight that comes with institutional authority. We have another issue, Dr. Sterling. The IT director appeared beside her, a man in his early 50s with a 1st Battalion tattoo visible on his forearm, the kind of tattoo that meant he had carried a rifle professionally before he carried a laptop. He opened his computer without a word. Security footage played on the portable screen. Timestamp 2:56 a.m. Rachel performing the pericardiocentesis with the kind of technical precision that made everyone watching understand they were observing someone at the absolute apex of their craft. The IT director's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone reading an inventory list. You attempted to delete this footage at 6:23 a.m. yesterday morning. I have the server logs. I have your access attempts. And I preserved every frame. He clicked to the next image. Deleted file recovery. Recovered data. I also reported it to the State Medical Board 1 hour ago. The CEO stood. When she did, everyone else's sitting became a liability. You fabricated a scope of practice violation to terminate a decorated service member who saved a patient's life. Your brother-in-law has recused himself from the board and is under investigation for institutional bias. The nursing director has been placed on administrative leave pending review of her involvement in your campaign. Your 2019 malpractice settlement has been reopened for review given the pattern of conduct we're observing. And effective immediately, your medical license is suspended pending investigation by the state board. She let that settle like snow. Security will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be boxed and shipped to your home address. Do not return to this facility. Dr. Sterling's face was the color of old bone. Within 48 hours the story had leaked, local news first, then national. Decorated Navy veteran fired after saving Delta Force officer. The hospital's public relations team had given them no choice. Rachel hadn't called anyone. She hadn't released a statement. But the truth, once it was moving, moved like gravity. The colonel gave an interview where he called her Reaper and talked about Baghdad, about the skill that saved his life, about the fact that she had risked everything to help a patient and been punished for it by a man who couldn't even manage basic pharmacology. The Delta Force lieutenant colonel did a follow-up interview. The Army combat medic who had recognized her technique 18 months ago did another. The narrative flipped like a switch. By day 3, Dr. Sterling's medical license was suspended indefinitely. His wife had filed for divorce. His brother-in-law had resigned from the hospital board. The nursing director was terminated. The hospital's legal team contacted Rachel on day 5. They offered her a position designing a new veterans trauma program. They offered her a settlement that would have paid off her student loans for times over. They offered her a full-time position with benefits, with rank on her badge, with the authority to hire and train the staff she wanted. She said yes to the program. The settlement she donated to a non-profit that helped service members with PTSD. Some things had value beyond money. 6 months later, Rachel was moving through the corridors of Mercy General with a new kind of invisibility, not the invisibility of being overlooked, but the invisibility of being so clearly exactly what she was supposed to be that people didn't question it. Her white coat had her name embroidered with her rank. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, MSN, RN. Inside the coat's lining, pinned where only she could feel it when she reached for her stethoscope in those small hours before dawn when she was alone with her patients and her thoughts, was the faded unit patch from her old jacket. The one she had carefully removed from the lining of her service dress jacket before she had left San Diego for the first time as a civilian. The one that had lived in a drawer for 18 months while she pretended to be someone smaller. The Veterans Trauma Program had treated 217 patients. 217 former service members who had nowhere else to go, who needed someone who understood the specific geometry of survival, who knew that pain was data and that the worst wounds were often invisible. The Marine she'd treated last week had the same haunted eyes she used to see in the mirror. The Army medic who had recognized her technique 18 months ago now ran the second shift. The colonel had recovered fully and sent her a handwritten letter that she kept in her locker, the paper worn soft from rereading. She reached for her stethoscope and felt the unit patch brush against her fingertips. Someone had spotted Dr. Sterling the week before, selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in National City. His hands were moving through practice motions, the same hands that had thrown a patient chart at her feet, that had called in favors to destroy her career, that had tried to delete evidence of his own incompetence. His medical license was suspended indefinitely. His reputation had become a cautionary tale. Rachel didn't think about him often. She thought about the 37 people who had made it home because she didn't freeze when it mattered. She thought about the 4 soldiers in Baghdad who were still breathing because she knew exactly where to cut, exactly how much pressure, exactly when to call for extraction. She thought about the Delta Force colonel who had looked at her across a room full of hospital administrators and simply spoken her truest name, and how that single word had unraveled everything built on lies. At a veterans event 3 months later, a reporter asked her what she wanted people to know about veterans in healthcare, about the services that were being built for people like her, for people who carried their war with them into every room. Rachel touched the patch inside her coat, the one only she could see, and she said, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." The camera flashed. She didn't smile, but her eyes were clear. If you found Rachel's story powerful, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we upload. These stories only exist because of viewers like you. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Sterling's position? What would you do if you held a secret that could change everything? Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength exists, and we'll see you on the next one.